explain those Badlands. That's a hell of a name.
Welcome to the No Treason podcast. This is episode 5. I'm Jonathan Drake. Thank you so much for joining me. We'll go ahead and start off with a quick ad break. We've got a few of those to get through today. Start with Loaded Gun Coffee. Badlanders, you are all familiar with Loaded Gun Coffee. They have been longtime supporters of Badlands, and you may have met them in person at GART. But did you know they are a veteran-ran, family-owned shop in Lake Havasu, Arizona? Every bag of their whole bean coffee delivers a high-octane, patriotic punch of flavor. With a long family history of commitment to freedom, every bag is a testament of pride and honor. From the skilled farmers who cultivate each blend to their roasters that handpick the finest coffee beans from around the world, Loaded Gun Coffee has mastered their unique brewing methods, resulting in the best tasting coffee around. This coffee is smooth and delicious, the perfect way to start your mornings. Get over to badlandsmedia.tv/loaded. Use promo code Badlands to get 10% off your order. If you're in the Lake Havasu area, stop in their newly renovated store and say hi. That is badlandsmedia.tv/loaded, promo code Badlands. Stay loaded with Loaded Gun Coffee. We got an espresso machine a little while back. My daughter has a book club that she started over the last couple of months. And my wife was like, hey, it'd be kind of fun to make a bunch of girly coffee drinks for our daughter and her friends. And we'd already been talking about getting an espresso machine. So we used that as the justification. And I have to say, I'm not entirely disappointed at that. Okay, what are we doing with this podcast? I don't know about you, but prior to listening to Badlands, I'd never actually heard the term first principles thinking, listening to guys like Chris Paul and Burning Bright. But I realized that concept resonated with me because for most of my adult life, I've been operating under that premise, just not using that term. In my high school days, my family did a lot of stuff with worldview training, thinking about the world in terms of a lens that you view things through. There's a lot of first principles concepts in that idea as well. And I mentioned this last week, but when you're engaging in certain types of debate with people, you realize you're not actually debating facts, you're debating your core foundational values, and that's not necessarily something that you can just argue against. Obviously, at some point, you want people to shift their first principles. So that's kind of what we're doing here. We're taking first principles approach through the mind of Lysander Spooner in his essay, No Treason, the Constitution of No Authority, and then we're applying that to government. First, we try to apply that to what we see today, and that's a lot easier to do, to see how not much of what we see today as far as government is concerned follows any sort of first principles that we would say America was founded on. So then the more difficult task is applying that concept to the government that we supposedly had at the beginning and wondering if it's true that they based that government on those same first principles. The first principle that Spooner appeals to is the concept we've talked a lot about, we'll talk a lot more about, is natural law. And as a quick recap, natural meaning it's part of nature. It's not a layer that's been added on top. It's sifting past all those layers and getting down to the core and realizing that there's a pattern of behavior that is coded in nature. And that's where the word law would then apply, that these are standards or guidelines that God has encoded into reality itself, so that if you want to live in peace, there's a certain set of behaviors or standards that you would follow. And if you don't follow those, you're most likely going to be in a state of war. And I liken that to the probability factor in the book of Proverbs, where if you follow a certain standard of wisdom, then in general, you will have a more successful and peaceful life. And if you don't, then in general, your life will be rather miserable. Obviously, there's other factors that are at play from our perspective, random chance of weather and other types of disasters. But as far as what we intend to do, how we choose to live our lives, natural law comes into play. And then a natural extension of that, a logical extension of that, would be natural rights. Consent is the hallmark of that, respecting the property of the person. We would say respecting their sovereignty. And if you were to distill that down to a core concept, we would refer to that as the golden rule. Jesus says, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And if you think about that in terms of natural law in the way that Spooner lays it out, that certainly applies. And then you can distill that down even further to a single word, and it's love. That's obviously a high standard to try to live to, and I think that's one of the reasons why we tend to fail so much. But if you were to think about that thought experiment that went through last week with the guy coming to your house with a contract and claiming that based on this contract, you owed a certain amount of money, but you'd never agreed to that contract, you'd never consented to that contract, would you want your consent to be respected, or would you be okay with it being violated in that case? And the purpose of that thought experiment is to get you to examine your own self and realize that actually this is something that is something like core inside of who I am as a person, and recognize that that is indeed a first principle that we should be moving forward on and discussing what government should be, or any of our relationships should be. We looked at, over the last number of weeks, logical requirements then that would be based in natural law for managing a contract like that. We looked at how consent, being the hallmark, should be voluntary. It should be explicit. The contract should be based on honesty. That's where I mentioned Ash had asked me about informed consent, and that's where informed consent would fit in, because if you've been withheld information, you aren't really entering into an honest contract. And then the contract needs to be just. You can't engage in criminal activity protected by a contract. And then lastly, considering again that consent is the hallmark, everyone bound by the contract needs to have an opportunity to consent. So that would fall under the term I came up with of universally individual. So applying that then again to government we have today, it's easy to see that we don't really have that going on. Consent is more of a narrative device that's used when they manufacture election results, manufacture polling. And if they decide that they don't really care about that because the purpose is too great, the greater good, or any of the other terms that people use to obfuscate the fact they're just violating your consent. We saw that with the lockdowns. We see that with taxes. We see that with endless wars, limitless regulations. The difficult challenge then becomes applying those concepts to the government as we were told we had or have. We can easily see that those first principles, natural law, the founding fathers talked about that a lot, and they used that as the basis for rebelling against England. But then they turn around, and it would appear that they just spurned those same principles when they formed the U.S. government under the Constitution. That's obvious in language such as the 3/5 clause, or whatever you want to call it, codifying black men being less valuable than white men. And actually, Spooner was a fierce abolitionist prior to the Civil War. And then his commentary on the Civil War of getting rid of slavery is a farce, or his commentary is not a farce. He's pointing out that the reason for the Civil War being to end slavery was a farce, because rather than getting rid of slaves, it actually created an entire nation, or essentially set in stone that an entire nation would be perpetually enslaved. So then we're left with the uncomfortable reality that we don't live in the country that we thought we did, and really we never have. So an obvious question stemming from that, what does that mean for us going forward? Well, we're not done sifting through the Constitution through this framework. We're going to go ahead and continue that today. But before we get to that, get to our second ad break. Listen to Mike Lindell and MyPillow.
I'm excited to announce that we're having our biggest 3-in-1 sale ever with a limited edition product, a back in stock special, and a closeout deal you won't find anywhere else. So go to MyPillow.com or call the number on your screen. Use your promo code to get our MyPillow bed sheets, only $29.88. Any color, any style, any size, even kings, regular $119.98, only $29.88. Once they're gone for good. How about our My Towels? They're finally back in stock, but not for long. Get a 6-piece My Towel set, regular $69.98, now only $39.98. And for the first time and the only time ever, get our limited edition premium My Pillows. They're made with Giza cotton and designer gusset. Queen $17.98, Kings only $19.98. So go to MyPillow.com or call the number on your screen. Use your promo code to get the best offers ever. Quantities are extremely limited, so order now.
So before we get into our material for this episode, I want to highlight a few comments that were dropped in the live chat last week. We have Kelly Kari Jen. She said, I have never considered this perspective at all. Loving this. And that was in context of judges, how they would not accept the Constitution as it is written as a contract, even though their authority is ostensibly derived from it. Catfish says, what? I don't understand. So we ignore the Constitution because we didn't sign it? The simple answer to that is, think through that thought experiment that I went through last week. Would you be okay being held accountable to a contract that you had not signed, meaning you had not indicated that you agree to it? That's the whole purpose of the signing. It's not just some sort of mythological or nebulous concept. It's the idea that you have indicated you have read and understood the contract and you are willing to be bound by it, and then you sign it. And until that is accomplished, no one can point to that contract and claim that you have obligation to it, because you had not been given an opportunity or had not indicated your willingness to consent. And then Zenith Sunchick wrote, my brain hurts. Well, I do apologize for any intracranial discomfort, but such is life. All right, so last week we covered sections 4 and 5. Tonight we're going to cover sections 6 and 7. I mentioned we'd start speeding up throughout the middle sections here, and that'll get even more true over the next couple of weeks. Section 6 covers new ground, specifically the burden of responsibility implied by the constitutional contract as it is written. And then Section 7 will take that new ground and apply it back to the concept we talked about last week of the signing of a contract. So Section 6 begins. It is no exaggeration, but a literal truth to say that by the Constitution, not as I interpret it, but as it is interpreted by those who pretend to administer it, the properties, liberties, and lives of the entire people of the United States are surrendered unreservedly into the hands of men who, it is provided by the Constitution itself, shall never be questioned as to any disposal they make of them. What is Spooner referring to with that? He writes, thus, the Constitution, Article 1, Section 6, provides that for any speech or debate, and he adds, or vote, In either house, they, that is the senators and representatives, shall not be questioned in any other place. And why is this relevant? He explains the whole lawmaking power is given to these senators and representatives. Then he adds, when acting by a 2/3 vote, and he has a mark for a footnote we'll get to in just a minute. And this provision protects them from all responsibility for the laws they make. And the footnote he provides says, and this 2/3 vote may be but 2/3 of a quorum, that is 2/3 of a majority instead of 2/3 of the whole. And the relevance then is, thus the whole power of the government is in their hands, and they are made utterly irresponsible for the use they make of it. What is this but absolute irresponsible power? And by irresponsible, he means that in a way that is not readily apparent, at least it was to me when I read it, because we tend to think of irresponsible in regards to a person who's not very mature, but that's not what he is meaning by that, and we'll get into that in a little bit. Now, as a side note, the speech and debate clause, that's something that we've encountered really within the last few years. Trump's indictments and the claims of presidential immunity tie back to this concept. And the reasons why it is that we're told that it's important in the Constitution and is such an awesome thing are typically these three reasons here. One, it removes fear of retaliation from other branches of government. This clause ensures that the members of Congress can perform their legislative duties without fear of intimidation, prosecution, or retaliation by the executive or judicial branches. And the way it's applied, that also works for each one of the branches in respect to the other two. Second, it preserves the separation of powers. And then third, it removes shackles on debate. And the basic argument is that we can't have an effective government if the agents of the government are in constant fear that they'll be targeted for their actions as agents of the government. So, in my opinion, these reasons effectively make the entire concept of checks and balances utterly meaningless. What sort of debate are they seeking to protect? If, as an agent of the government, in whatever branch, if your actions are compliant with natural law, or even going up a step above that, if your actions are compliant with the Constitution itself, thinking of the Bill of Rights and the other legitimate amendments, what do you have to be afraid of? Thinking of truth as the infinite player in game theory, if you have nothing to hide, if you're operating in a truthful and honest manner, why would you need such protections? This makes me think of making the news recently, Adam Schiff seeking to protect intelligence obtained or prevent intelligence obtained by the military from being used in any sort of civil legal actions. That doesn't seem to be the actions of a person who has nothing to hide. That seems like the actions of a person who's done something they know is wrong, or at least they know it would be perceived as wrong, and they're trying to cover their tracks. So think about this. If a congressman, if a congressman writes a bill that proposes an action that violates natural rights, especially those delineated in the Bill of Rights, or let's say they vote yes on such a bill, in other words, they are intending to violate your rights. They are intending to violate their oath even. They're planning these actions. They're taking steps towards those actions. Let's say they're doing that towards free speech. How is that any different in principle to any other crime, like attempted robbery or attempted murder? Why is it that we would enforce attempted crimes in the civil sphere, but we don't enforce attempted crimes within government? We have all probably uttered the phrase that the Constitution is the law of the land. So if the Constitution is the law of the land, and as such, it is then technically illegal for Congress to make a law that violates the Bill of Rights, would that not make the violation of free speech a crime and not just an oopsie? It's kind of treated that way now. They're not really held to account for violating the Constitution. And if this Constitution is the supposed law, should not the attempt to violate the law while acting as an agent of the government be similarly considered a crime? If the speaking and debating in question is speaking and debating to what extent the government intends to violate your rights, how is it harmful to stifle such debate and thereby remove the responsibility of an agent of the government for the crimes they commit? Conspiracy to commit a crime is considered a crime on its own. So why don't we apply this same standard to agents of the government? And to the claim that this would limit the effectiveness of the government, given what power is wielded by government, how is this a legitimate argument in favor of removing any speed bumps to prevent their actions? I would argue that being in favor of the speech and debate clause indicates a particular naivete about the nature of government. We're talking about an institution that is empowered to wield, as Spooner points out, absolute power over the people underneath it, even to the point of death. And he points that out with the Civil War, how the government was able to effectively kill off around 1 million people, or maybe even more, to punish those who would rebel against it. Now, a counter argument to these concerns would be that the explicit wording of the clause is speech and debate and not legislative actions. So if they voted in favor of a law that violates natural rights, that's not covered in the speech and debate clause. This would be a valid point, except for what I mentioned regarding conspiracy to commit crimes being held accountable for us. But then going back, the earliest I could find was 1838, a case before the Supreme Court, Kendall v. United States. Legislative acts received immunity, and that has been the precedent ever since, and that has been continually reinforced. And I would say this speaks to Spooner's quote that I've highlighted a number of times in the appendix, in regards to the Constitution as it is written, either authorized the government that we have or was powerless to prevent its becoming this way. And with the speech and debate clause being written into the Constitution, that would speak towards actually authorizing the government that we have. Because the result of the speech and debate clause, as it is written and as it has been interpreted and applied, is that we have a government that has provided immunity for itself and has divested itself of any responsibility. In conversations about vaccinations, many of us would point to the late 80s law that removed the liability of vaccine manufacturers for any damages that their products would inflict on the population. And we would point to that as an obvious conflict of interest and an obvious problem, because it essentially gives those vaccine manufacturers free rein to do whatever they want. So the speech and debate clause essentially allows individuals in the government to not be held personally liable for any screw-ups or intentional violations, which removes that fear that they should have in forcing them to think through very deeply what they are about to do, recognizing that they could be held responsible if they violate our natural rights. And then you have to wonder, if the government harms you, if a specific agent in the government presents a bill, votes on a bill, enforces a law that violates your natural rights, who pays if you win a lawsuit? If it's like, let's say you sue the government over those damages, who's the one that actually pays for that? Is it the person that initiated the crime? Well, no, because the damages will be paid out by means of taxation. So in other words, you're cutting your nose off to spite your face. You're harming your neighbor. You're harming yourself because the government will just tax you to pay their legal bills. So how are we supposed to hold these government agents accountable then? And the argument is that the founders provided supposed safeguards against abuse of this immunity that was provided. And Spooner highlights them as the oaths that they take. We have elections, and then because of these elections, these government overseers are chosen by the people. So before we dive into the particulars of the safeguards, I want to explore what Spooner means by absolute and irresponsible power. Earlier, I quoted Spooner asking, what is this but absolute irresponsible power? So what is actual rightful power? Anyone with little scruples, some money and some weapons and maybe some compatriots can try and exercise dominion or control over another person, but we would not recognize that as being rightful. Right by might is not something that we consider to be a moral standpoint. What we're interested in then is rightful power, power that complies with natural law, power that reinforces peace and doesn't create a condition of war. In short, what we're talking about is the right of property. Spooner writes, the loveliness of the English language, different kind of right here. The right of absolute and irresponsible dominion is the right of property, and the right of property is the right of absolute irresponsible dominion. The two are identical, the one necessarily implying the other. Neither can exist without the other. So what is he talking about? We might use a term like personal sovereignty, the final say, the consent over your consent, over your body, over your resources, your home, your money, or if you're a Bitcoiner, you could condense all those into one word, your energy. It is indivisible. Someone else cannot have a final say over my hand if I don't have, and then I would have the final say over the rest of my body. If I have no say over my hand, by extension, I actually have no say over my entire body. I cannot compartmentalize myself off in that way. Someone else cannot have final say over 30 to 40% of my money without having final say over the remaining percentage. This is especially evident in my mind if you reframe your money as your energy. When you consider what lengths we go to get money, we have to expend a lot of energy in order to do so. When he says irresponsible, he means not dependent on anyone else, not beholden to anyone else. You're not withheld by a legal, in context of natural law, claim. The idea is that within your lawful domain, within the realm of your property, you may do whatever you want. That doesn't mean you can. There are natural boundaries. For instance, I may jump 100 feet into the air because I own my body. It's my property. I cannot actually do that. Physically, unfortunately, I'm not able to do that. I may build a catapult if I own the materials, because the materials are mine. My energy is mine that I expend to build the catapult. I may not put you in the catapult against your will and launch you 100 feet into the air. So we can see there are natural boundaries, physical boundaries, and then there are legal boundaries. We're all familiar with the concept. I've mentioned this before. The idea of my rights stop where yours begins. That is a natural law consistent principle. So what does this imply about the power of the government? This question really cuts to the heart of what we are talking about. And Spooner writes, if therefore Congress have that absolute and irresponsible, that is, not legally beholden, lawmaking power, which the Constitution, according to their interpretation of it, gives them, it can only be because they own us as property. If they own us as property, they are our masters, and their will is our law. If they do not own us as property, they are not our masters, and their will, as such, is of no authority over us. So again, property rights equals absolute and irresponsible power, and vice versa. If the government has absolute and irresponsible power, then the government has de facto property rights over all under its domain. The fact they don't exercise that power in every case is not an argument that they don't claim the right to have that power, or they don't actually possess that power. And again, going back to the question of rightful power, we would not say that is rightful power. We would say that is a usurpation of rightful power. The ever-increasing size of government is a clear indication that they do claim that right, but for whatever reason, they don't action on that claim. We can think of any number of reasons. We are all familiar with the concept of a frog in a pot of water that is slowly brought to a boil won't jump out. So maybe for the purpose of preventing an outright revolt, they don't just clamp down and seize that power altogether. And it's the fact that they cannot be held accountable for violating the Bill of Rights that makes their authority irresponsible and therefore absolute. Because if power is irresponsible, it is absolute. So why doesn't the government just admit that they have this total control? I would say that in the enlightened age of our democracy, it's not a good sell to go around admitting that you're a totalitarian dictator. You would say, oh, we don't have overlords, we have representatives. But if those representatives can't be held accountable for the things they do as representatives in relation to us, they hold each other accountable for various corruption crimes. But when it comes to violating natural law, they don't hold themselves accountable. So to say there are representatives and not our overlords is a bit of a misnomer. Spooner writes, but these men who claim and exercise this absolute and irresponsible dominion over us dare not be consistent and claim either to be our masters or to own us as property. They say they are only our servants, agents, attorneys, and representatives. But this declaration involves an absurdity, a contradiction. No man can be my servant, agent, attorney, or representative and be at the same time uncontrollable by me and irresponsible to me for his acts. It is of no importance that I appointed him and put all power in his hands. If I made him uncontrollable by me and irresponsible to me, he is no longer my servant, agent, attorney, or representative. He continues, if I gave him absolute, irresponsible power over my property, I gave him the property. And due to the nature of property, it is absolute and irresponsible power and vice versa. So if we give this irresponsible power to the government, we are in effect giving them complete and absolute power over ourselves. Spooner writes to that effect, if I gave him absolute, irresponsible power over myself, I made him my master and gave myself to him as a slave. And that is a sobering thought. Now back to the safeguards. We have no real recourse within the Constitution as it is written for true redress of usurpations. We have ideas that are written down, but they are effectively meaningless. The first that Spooner highlights would be the oaths that these officers take upon taking their office. We will get into that at least, well, I'm hoping maybe to get into it next week. It's in the sections after the ones that I definitely want to cover next week. But Spooner makes the argument effectively that oaths are meaningless. So I won't go into that too deep, besides the point that Spooner makes in this section that what good is an oath when the officer knows they cannot be questioned? They'll promise whatever you want when they know that they can't be questioned on it. Sure, I'll promise whatever you want. Second, in regards to elections, they're fake. They've always been fake. And even if they were real, your only option is to replace this untouchable government agent with another untouchable government agent. So you're just kicking the can down the road. Spooner writes, neither is it any answer to this view of the case to say that the particular individuals holding this power can be changed once in 2 or 6 years, for the power of each set of men is absolute during the term for which they hold it. And when they can hold it no longer, they are succeeded only by men whose power will be equally absolute and irresponsible. The third, pull back that slide, the idea of chosen by the people. To say that we, at least as the people, have the privilege of choosing these unassailable government agents. Spooner says, a man is nonetheless a slave because he is allowed to choose a new master once in a term of years. Neither are a people any less the slaves because permitted periodically to choose new masters. What makes them slaves is the fact that they now are and are always hereafter to be in the hands of men whose power over them is and always is to be absolute and irresponsible. If you're tempted to say, you know what, no thanks, I'm just going to leave, secede, if you will, Spooner would tell you to ask the southern states how well that worked out for them. And you might argue that, well, the Civil War was unconstitutional. That was the government overreaching its authority. I would refer you then to Spooner's quote I've already mentioned in this episode and will probably mention many, many times about the inability of the Constitution to prevent such dramatic overreach. So it was either codified, which he makes the case here with them having absolute irresponsible power because they can't be questioned, or it was unable to stop them in effecting those overreaches. All right, let's take another break real quick. And while we're approaching government from a first principle standpoint, let's hear a word from Badlands' own product line that is also trying to approach health and skincare from a foundational perspective using timeless and natural ingredients.
Before skincare went synthetic, people used something simple, something real. Tallow. Grass-fed and finished beef tallow is packed with vitamins A, D, E, and K. Nutrients your skin actually knows what to do with. It locks in moisture, restores elasticity, and defends against winter dryness. No water, no preservatives, and no BS. Unlike plant oils or chemical creams, tallow mimics your skin's own structure. Elbows, hands, knees, post-shave, anywhere your skin's crying for real moisture. Perfect for gifting or keeping your own skin soft when the cold hits. Visit softdisclosure.com and use promo code Badlands for 15% off. Ancient care, modern truth.
Self-disclosure. So we're talking about absolute and irresponsible power, and we've talked a little bit about property rights. If you have some interest in doing some further reading on that, Spooner lays out his concept of property rights in an essay called The Law of Intellectual Property, or an essay on the right of authors and inventors to a perpetual property in their ideas. I actually disagree with his conclusions in this in regards to intellectual property. That's a whole other topic. But in laying his foundation for why he thinks that ideas have property rights, he establishes his view of property rights, which is pretty common in the libertarian sphere. I would encourage you to read that essay, if not just for the section in which he discusses his view on property. I'll have a link in the description below. You can get access to a free PDF on that. So we're talking about the Constitution as a contract, and what a peculiar contract it is, because we have people picking agents and representatives, but the agents themselves bear no responsibility for their actions as agents. Think about the contracts that you would enter in the course of normal life. Does this at all strike you as the type of contract that you would want to enter in, where you might be held liable for damages, or the person you're contracting with can't be held liable for damages? Would you hire a tree service if that service was not able to be held liable for any damages they inflict in the course of trimming trees? Let's say they drop a branch on your car or on your neighbor's car. Businesses carry insurance to protect against that sort of thing, and they usually denote that in their contract. I know I would not likely hire a service without that type of insurance, because I know that I don't want to have to pay for a new roof or a new car for my neighbor or something along those lines. And then imagine if you're the neighbor and the tree branch or the tree falls on their car and smashes it, and they're looking at their car and they're looking at you as your neighbor, and they find out that actually not only can that tree service not be held accountable, but you can't be held accountable either as the one who hired the agent. This is relevant because as the Constitution is written, it absolves the people, the foundational power behind the government, of any individual liability. And how is that? Well, first of all, we have a secret ballot. No court deriving its authority under the Constitution would hear a case being brought against an individual elector for the manner in which they voted. We saw this on a macro scale in 2020, that the courts wouldn't even allow standing for one state against another state when they sued in regards to how that other state conducted its elections and violated election rules. And the point is that we are deprived then of any meaningful methods for holding this government accountable. We can't go after the agents, and we can't go after the hiring body of those agents. We cannot go after individual electors. The only recourse that we're really given is to replace the offending government with a new one, or the government agents rather, with a new one. And this speaks to, I brought this up in episode 1 in discussing social contract theory, that I'm convinced that social contract theory itself was allowed to propagate and be developed as a controlled opposition mechanism, because it acts, as I said, a pressure relief valve for political discussion, but doesn't allow people to really get to the heart of the problem and actually change their form of government or change the government at all. The conclusion of Section 6 then is that the Constitution is written so that no government agent is responsible, which then gives them absolute irresponsible power, i.e., property rights, which therefore makes us all slaves. And to reiterate, the only right of absolute and irresponsible power is property rights. And if the government claims that power, which they do by removing themselves from any means of being questioned or held accountable for violation of natural rights, they are actually claiming ownership over every single one of us. And because of this, there really is no meaningful mechanism for redress of wrongs. And to further that point, even if elections were real, we are still only being allowed to choose a new slave master. And we might get excited that we got to choose that slave master on paper versus machine, but the result is the same, whichever way you slice it. No individual elector can be held responsible. You can't go to your neighbor and argue that they damaged you by the way they voted, because you can't actually prove in court how they voted because of the secret ballot system. So in effect, the Constitution creates a government that cannot be held responsible, and its creators cannot be held responsible either. And therefore, anyone acting under the authority of the Constitution, Spooner concludes, isn't acting as anyone's agent other than themselves, and as such, by right of natural law, can be held individually responsible for the damages they inflict. Whether or not we realize that and action on that is an entirely different conversation. Moving into Section 7, it reminds us that the contract was never signed, and it points out, first of all, no one has ever been asked to sign it from day one. And then secondly, thinking of the tree service, would you actually sign a contract in the way that it's written, where your agents are effectively created to be masters over you? And if you wouldn't sign a contract like that for a lesser matter, again, the tree service or any other service industry, would you sign a contract like that for the government, which has the authority and uses that authority to kill you if you don't comply? But let's say there are people who would sign a contract like that. And Spooner addresses this point. He says, if the people of this country wish to maintain such a government as the Constitution describes, there's no reason in the world why they should not sign the instrument itself, and thus make known their wishes in an open, authentic manner, in such manner as the common sense and experience of mankind have shown to be reasonable and necessary in such cases, and in such a manner as to make themselves, as they ought to do, individually responsible for the acts of the government. And if they want to sign it, he says, if any considerable number of the people believe the Constitution to be good, why do they not sign it themselves and make laws for and administer them upon each other, leaving all other persons who do not interfere with them in peace? The fact that this doesn't happen opens the door for an uncomfortable reality or uncomfortable reality check on the heart of mankind. The willingness we have to subjugate our fellow men, violating their natural rights with the hope of obtaining whatever security or other benefits the state seems to offer. It is often that when bringing up these arguments, the person I'm talking to realizes what I'm implying, that there really shouldn't be such a thing as the state. I get asked, well, who will build the roads? I'm reminded of the Benjamin Franklin quote about exchanging liberty for safety and thus being deserving of neither. That thought came to my mind quite a lot during the COVID debacle. And then I'm reminded further of the quote that I mentioned from last week, in which Spooner refers to the Constitution and decries it as the folly and wickedness of mankind. So in conclusion, sections 6 and 7 represent to me some of the most compelling aspects of Spooner's overall argument. The speech and debate clause is the effectual Achilles heel of this system because it has codified the exact opposite reality to the story that we are told about the hallowed sanctity of a government chosen by the people. Instead of creating a government with limitless accountability, it has created a monster accountable to no one except itself. And what is this except a true dictatorship? What difference does it really make whether a tyrant king hands off the crown to his heir, or a president or a senator hands over power to a newly elected president or senator, if neither king nor president nor senator can ever be held accountable for violating natural law? We are conditioned to celebrate the peaceful handoff every 2, 4, or 6 years of the effectual whip that beats us, as if somehow the hand that swings it makes much of a difference. We get excited when the hand holding the whip belongs to a person we perceive to be on our team. And the entirety of our political action then is focused on making sure our team is the one holding the whip. And thus we are caught in an endless loop of being the whipped for a period of 4 or 8 years or however long, and then being the ones doing the whipping for a period of the same. You know, maybe we are stuck in this reality. The southern states certainly learned that the hard way during the Civil War. But are we doing ourselves any favors if we don't call this system for what it really is? Are we being honest when we shroud the system in euphemism? I mentioned that my older brother, who introduced me to Spooner and mentored me in a lot of these things, he used to say that a euphemism is just a euphemism for lying. With that framework, we can see this entire system is built on layer after layer of euphemisms, the layer after layer of lies. And I recognize that speaking of the Constitution in this way is really uncomfortable for some people. I kind of crossed that bridge a long time ago. But we in this community, this Badlands audience, we're all already familiar with how uncomfortable, challenging, accepted reality can be, and we have found a common identity in that. So in light of how important community truly is,
here on the sun-kissed shores of Cocoa Beach, where the ocean meets the horizon, the Great American Restoration Tour continues on November 6th through the 9th, 2025. Badlands Media gathers patriots like you, not just to talk, but to rebuild. From truth-telling panels to unbreakable bonds, we're restoring the soul of our nation, one conversation at a time. This is the heart of the Space Coast, where the rockets defy gravity and dreams touch the stars. Feel the thunder of innovation that powers America forward. Together, we're not just healing the past, we're blasting off into a brighter tomorrow, a future where truth prevails, families thrive, and America leads once more. Join us in Cocoa Beach. Get your seat or your virtual stream pass now at badlandsmedia.tv/events. Launch is imminent, and you don't want to miss this liftoff.
So, yep, Gart, Cocoa Beach is next weekend. I'm going to have some serious FOMO next weekend, that's for sure. Get your virtual tickets, join the Telegram chat, be able to watch the live streams of the panels, ask questions of those panels through the Telegram chat, get your virtual tickets, or if you're able to make it down there in person, I highly encourage you to do so. Garts are awesome. Go to badlandsmedia.tv/events. Speaking of community, it's small but growing. I mentioned I started a Telegram chat for this podcast, t.me/the No Treason podcast. I'll post show announcements, and then there's a chat. If you leave a comment on one of the posts, you can join the chat, ask questions, engage in debate. We've had a few good conversations so far. Encourage you to do that as well. So looking ahead, the next 3 sections are going to be all about the secret ballot system. We've touched on that a number of times, but Spooner really does a deep dive in those next 3 sections. I'll be able to get them into one episode. And then the next 5 sections after that cover the efficacy of oaths. And it sounds like a lot, but it's a relatively simple argument. He just exhaustively breaks it down, all the different people that are held accountable by oaths or said to be held accountable by oaths. So I might be able to combine that with a discussion on the secret ballot. We'll kind of see how that goes as I prepare my notes. After that, after Spooner has thoroughly stripped the Constitution bare, he gets into who the real rulers are, something that I've already alluded to in episode 3 when I quoted him as saying, all political power, as it is called, rests practically upon this matter of money. Now, as a member of the truth community, it should immediately bring to your mind something that we're all keenly aware of, the international banking cartel. But first, we'll cover the secret ballot and hopefully the oaths. But I will see you all next week. So I appreciate you joining me, and take care.
Why a spoon, cousin? Why not an axe?
Because it's dull, you twit. It'll hurt more.
Thank you so much for joining us, and don't forget to hit the thumbs up on this video. And a special thank you to all of our advertising partners. Please remember to shift your dollars to support those businesses that support Badlands Media.